Shalom and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. This is a recording of Rabbi Avi Havivi's weekly Siddur class.
To review where we are, I'm sorry we sort of took the break when we did, which is we just started 1 week talking about ideas about God in the Kabbalah and classical Jewish mysticism. And I'm going to review a little bit of that. Today, we're going to start talking about the Sefirot and the attributes of God, and we'll be doing that for probably 2 weeks, just to foreshadow what we're going to talk about when we're talking about classical Kabbalah, which means the Zohar and its era. We talked last time about the infinite, the Ein Sof, the aspect of God that's inaccessible. Today and maybe next week, we'll talk about aspects of God manifestations in this world called the Sefirot. We're also going to talk about the Shekhinah. We're going to talk about male and female and maybe one other thing, okay, that I've forgotten at the moment. And then we'll try to talk about the next phase of Jewish mysticism, which is the Kabbalah of the Ari, Rabbi Isaac Lurius, which comes about 300 years after what we're talking about now. So it's kind of Kabbalah phase 1 and then Kabbalah phase 2. We're in Kabbalah phase 1. Okay. So today we're going to talk about the Sefirot, the attributes or aspects of God. And in this line of thinking, the Kabbalah is trying to address the following challenge in understanding God. The challenge is God one thing? I hate to use the word thing, entity, whatever. Is God one entity, one unity, or is God multiple things? On the one hand, as monotheists, right, the core idea is God is one entity and all different manifestations of God are all manifestations of the one. On the other hand, divinity sometimes comes across to us, or we perceive divinity in all kinds of different ways. Now, for the pagans, for polytheists, this is no problem. They just said there's multiple gods. There's the God of birth, there's the God of rain, there's the God of the river, there's the God of death, and these are all conflicting forces in the universe. All right? So for monotheism, they all have to be yoked under one unitary force, but there still needs to be some acknowledgement or grappling with the fact that we experience these forces, we experience this force very differently at different times, okay? You know, when you see the sunrise in a beautiful location, you feel like God is present, however you understand that spiritually. When a baby is born, that's a spiritual moment. When you're sitting with someone and they breathe their last breath, that's a spiritual moment. Those things are all so different from each other. And how do we grapple with balancing the oneness with the differentness? I hope you get kind of the question. So for Maimonides, just to take us back, it was simple. Anything that looks like differentness is just an illusion. It's an illusion. It's because of our little human pea brain. So things look different to us at different times. And the goal of being a religious person, as much as possible, is to God is pure intelligence, unified, undivided, pure intelligence, and theologically, you get closer to God by contemplating that with your intelligence, and the closer you come to grasping that, the closer you come to, I don't want to say understanding God, the closer you come to God. Okay, recognizing that all those different manifestations are just an illusion because of your limited, finite brain. Okay. Kabbalah takes a different approach. It basically says there's a unity, but the unity pours itself into different attributes. Okay. And at various times, we will encounter different attributes. And by the way, they use various metaphors for this pouring. Sometimes it's the metaphor of light. light spills from here to there. And one metaphor is the sun, right? The source of all light is the sun, but no one can apprehend the sun directly because you'd go blind. So we see the sun reflecting off the moon, and we see the sun shining off a window, and we see the sun illuminating a leaf, and light looks different to us, even though there's all one source. Sometimes the metaphor is a flow. Sometimes the metaphor is emanation. That's kind of their technical term, okay? So God, from some original source of God's self, emanates forth, or pours forth, or lights forth, and there are other metaphors, into different aspects. And these are the aspects of God that we apprehend. And that's why sometimes we say God is being mean, or God is being loving, or God is being majestic, because these are just different attributes of God, and these are the only things that are accessible to us. The Ein Sof that we talked about last time, the infinite, undifferentiated God, is like Maimonides' God. It is unapproachable and uncomprehensible. Okay, I think I'm gonna do tachlis, practical, and then work backwards from there. So first of all, beforehand, now, okay, we can't open this file. Something went wrong. I'm not happy about that. That's a bad thing. Okay, you got to give me a minute, hopefully not longer than. Are there any questions last night? So email. Oh, I have it. Okay, now I have it. There. Okay, I'm going to share the screen. Oh, there are 10 Sefirot, and numbers are very important. Okay, these are the 10 Sefirot. I can say the names. We're going to go over all of them, actually. Okay. By the way, note that, and so the 10 Sefirot are usually laid out in a pattern that looks something like this, and sometimes they'll put a tree in there, and they'll say it's like a tree, which has, branches and roots and a trunk. And sorry, I'm going to make you dizzy because I'm going to go doot, 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 doot. And sometimes they'll map a humanoid onto it and say something like this Sefirah is God's left leg and this Sefirah is God's right arm. Okay? Now, Sefirah in the earliest Kabbalah, like the word lispor, means a number. And there are 10 Sefirot in the earliest Kabbalah, just means numerals. Okay? And the earliest Kabbalah, by which I mean, I don't know, the year 1000-ish. I don't know, I might be wrong about that. It says basically the universe is made out of what we would call elements or atoms, but they say 32 basic things, substances, which are the 22 Hebrew letters and the 10 numerals. So that's their way of saying the universe is composed of little bits. We would say the same thing too, right? We would just have a physics explanation of how it's composed of little bits. And the earliest Kabbalah says, no, the little bits are the letters and numerals. So very early on, the Sefirot are just the 10 numerals, which are 10 out of the 32 building blocks of the universe, out of which God constructed the universe. But in classic Kabbalah, in the 100 years before the Zohar and the Zohar and the 100 years after the Zohar, these Sefirot become not numerals, but qualities. Okay? I'm just going to say what they are. Keter, Chochmah, and Bina, Chesed and Din, Tiferet, Netzach and Hod, Yesod, and Malchut. And we'll go through these. And they basically say God flows into these, God causes God's self to flow into different channels, bowls, lights, manifestations. So out here, there's the Ein Sof, the infinite, and we talked about that last time. This is the aspect of God that is unknowable to us. And it is, as we said last time, and I will repeat many times, it sounds a lot like Maimonides' version of God. Okay. But the Ein Sof, which cannot be grasped by humans, chooses to reveal itself to humans through an act of will, and it does so through these 10 channels. By the way, sometimes, and we'll get to this, sometimes there is hierarchy in these channels. Sometimes there is higher and lower. Sometimes there is left and right, and that's important. Okay? So higher and lower can be important. Left and right can be important. For the moment, we're not going to get into higher and lower, and we're not going to get into left and right. We'll just call them different. Okay? So Keter, what does Keter mean? Alan or Michael, do you know, right? He's muted. I know what he means. Say it again.
Crown.
Crown. So this is not really an aspect or quality of God. It's just crown. And by the way, the Zohar itself only uses these terms sometimes and very often refers to them elliptically. And the Zohar says things like, first there was a point, and then the point poured itself into, there was a point of infinite darkness, and it poured itself into a point of light, and then the point of light radiated out into a channel, and the channel poured into a bowl. So it refers to these things elliptically, only sometimes by their name, and it assumes you know what it's talking about. Again, Zohar 1290 of the Common Era. It assumes you know what it's talking about because what the Sefirot were was already worked out like 100 years before the Zohar, okay? And the Zohar assumes you know this, and so the Zohar refers to these things elliptically and symbolically. Keter is the beginning of God's will in the world, deciding to create everything, and is generally inaccessible to us. And there's arguments about how is Keter really different than Ein Sof, because it's very similar, because it's inaccessible to us. So Ein Sof is the infinite, is the aspect of God outside of everything, and then Ein Sof radiates Keter, and Keter is the aspect of God that wants to create everything in the world, but is inaccessible to us. Footnote, as you are well aware, the Bible uses a number of words for God. El, Elohim, the holy name Yud-He and Vav-He, which is usually vocalized with the vowels of Adonai, but once in a while Adonai is written out Aleph, Daled, Nun, Yud, and there's Yah, and there's Tzivaot, God of hosts, and the Kabbalah links each one of these names of God to one of the Sefirot. All right? What's helpful is that the name of God that's associated with Keter, the beginning of God's presence in the universe that is inaccessible to us, that name of God is Eheyeh Asher Eheyeh. I will be that I will be, from Exodus, right? Moshe at the bush says to the appearance of God, so what should I tell the people? Who are you? And God says, I will be that I will be. The Ten Commandments, right? Whoever's voice that was, that they then slowed down on the tape loop. Okay? So, which is by the way, a very useful name of God for Keter, right? Because all the commentators say, Eheyeh Asher Eheyeh means I will be present or manifest to them in different ways at different times. Okay? So Keter is the essence of God in the world that contains all the potentialities and which is generally inaccessible to us. Okay, here, where my cursor is. From this unknowable, two different books about the Kabbalah that I've xeroxed for you. From this unknowable Ein Sof, the infinite, the impersonal, absolute, and infinite deity, that's part of Kabbalah, but again, it's a reminder of Maimonides. I'm going to say it again. Impersonal, absolute, and infinite deity, kind of outside the universe. The 10 above-mentioned Sefirot emanate. With the coming of the 10 Sefirot, the hidden and for us unknowable God displays 10 different aspects, qualities, or attributes of God's self. From the hiddenness of Ein Sof, God reveals 10 aspects of God's hidden life. Keter, the first Sefirah, is regarded as the highest and most elevated of the Sefirot. It is the first manifestation of the hidden deity in which its will to reveal itself is expressed. So God's will to reveal God's self to us in the world through different aspects is actually expressed in the world through Keter. Okay? And it is also sometimes called ayin, nothingness, shades of Buddhism. And it is very close to Ein Sof. And we're not going to talk a lot about it because we can't reach it. It's up there. Okay. Keter radiates chokhmah and then bina, which are two words for knowing. And chokhmah generally is understood as wisdom, and bina is sometimes translated as intelligence. I'm going to call it discernment. And how are chokhmah and bina different from itself? So when God enters the universe, of course, God's going to create the universe, but first the infinite needs to enter the universe. By the way, there are all kinds of theories about God needing to pull back, because if God didn't pull back, there'd be no room for the universe. God pulls back and has the will to create. That's Keter. And there's a plan in God's, I'm sorry, I'm being metaphoric, in God's mind. Okay? And God's mind has two aspects. Chokhmah is undifferentiated knowledge. In an infinite way, in God's mind, everything that's going to happen is there in one, what would be to us a jumble. Or this is God's Torah, undifferentiated wisdom. Bina is the specific thoughts and plans. So it's differentiated wisdom. And I don't know, you could probably, say something about neuroscience and the brain. One of them is just like the process of thinking, and one of them is the specific thoughts or something like that. Chokhmah is conceived of as, so this part of Kabbalah is very gendered. Chokhmah is conceived of as male, and Bina is conceived of as female. It's a male aspect of God's, I'm going to put it in air quotes, thought, and a female aspect. The male aspect is undifferentiated knowledge, wisdom, consciousness, and Bina is the specific differentiated and is conceived of as female. There are two, especially female aspects in the Sefirot system. The Sefirot are very interested in male, I'm going to call it apparently male and apparently female aspects of the divinity. Okay. And Bina is the upper female, and Bina is associated with Leah. Leah is the upper female. Let's guess, who's the lower female? If there's Leah, who should go with Leah? Anyone can.
Rachel.
Rachel, because who would go with Leah other than Rachel? So Bina is personified as Leah, and she's sometimes called the upper mother. Okay. And it's actually, just to foreshadow, Malchut, who is Rachel, who is the lower mother. And again, lower just means closer to our level of existence, right? So Bina is on a higher level of existence. Rachel is on, and Malchut is on a lower level of existence. And there's all kinds of Kabbalistic things about uniting the upper female and the lower female. Okay. And they're very often called in classical Kabbalah Abba and Ima. Chokhmah is Abba, father. Bina is mother. You can think of them as the I don't know. Sometimes when you don't know what to call something, you just use a fancy word. So I'll use the fancy word supernal, primordial. That's a slightly more accessible word. So Chokhmah is primordial male or supernal male principle. Bina is supernal female principle. And of course, they get together and have a baby, right? Which is Tiferet, but we'll get to that. Okay. I think I want to read a little something about Chokhmah and Bina. The next step in the emanation, I'm at the bottom of page that I labeled page 3. Next step in the emanation process is the second Sefirah, Chokhmah. In Chokhmah, the divine will to create, present in Keter, becomes a spiritual blueprint of our world. Chokhmah contains the divine ideas of all things that must come into being. Okay? through Chokhmah, the human being can get to know the divine will. We can't through Keter because we can't get to Keter. But then Bina, in this top of page 4, in this Sefirah, the still undifferentiated model of creation contained in Chokhmah is distinguished in all its components. Here, all things gain a more or less distinctive identity. The Kabbalah saw Chokhmah as an active masculine power and Bina as a passive feminine power, and they called them Abba and Im. One more thing I want to read about in another book about, by the way, here's another fancy, near the bottom of page 9 in the handout. Keter, the infinite, Ein Sof, is effulgent, which is a very fancy word on the SATs, which somehow means, I don't know. Does anyone know what effulgent means? Coming forth, shining forth, flowing forth, something like that. Okay? And the Sefirot are there to receive its essence. Okay.
Yeah, I'd say it comes from effluent, so.
Which means to flow. Okay. Okay, good. All right, so here, I just want to say a little more about Chokhmah and Bina. I have to get rid of the pictures of you. Able to read it. I am near the bottom, next to last paragraph on page. Chokhmah is the totality of divine thought before any single thought occurs. I'm going to say that again. Chokhmah is the totality of divine thought before any single thought occurs. So God thinks, I'm going to create everything, but God is not thinking specific things. All archetypes, ideas, things, principles exist in Chokhmah in potentiality. And it contains within itself, this last paragraph, the ideal prefiguration of all things. It is divine realm of the perfect model of and blueprint of everything that might come into existence at some later stage of God's unfolding of God's being. Chokhmah is the sum total of all the possibilities of everything that might conceivably come into being anywhere and at any time exists within Chokhmah as sheer possibility. Chokhmah is God's idea of what the world should. And then Chokhmah pours itself into Bina. Chokhmah, Abba impregnates Ima. Chokhmah impregnates Bina with the archetypes, ideas, and principles of all being. They grow within Bina as within a womb. Bina as the supernal mother is sometimes the images of a womb. Okay. And I don't have a good quote here, but basically this is where all of God's plans for the universe are differentiated. I don't know. So you might say, this is wrong, what I'm about to say, but you might say, you wanted to think of an analogy, you might say, God thought that God would create matter. That's Chokhmah. But different atoms and electrons and elements are Bina. Now, let me pause for a moment and talk more about how the Sefirot work. I think that before we go, and then I'll pause for questions. So, the system of the Sefirot is looked at in 3 different ways, depending on what book you're reading or what approach you're taking. One approach is what's called theosophy, knowledge of God. It explains how God works. Okay? It's just about understanding God. Aspect 2 about it, potentially, is how we relate to God. So the Kabbalists have all sort of things about, we're trying to strengthen God's deen, or we're trying to strengthen God's rachamim. So for the Kabbalists, even as there is divine energy coming down to us, there's also human energy that goes up and that can actually affect God. I'll say this again. For the Kabbalists, there's human energy that's going up the channels, and we can affect God. We can strengthen God or weaken God. That's a very gross statement. There's a lot of specifics in there. By the way, this is why Chabad drives around with mitzvah tanks and says, just do one mitzvah, because they have a core theology behind that. Because Chabad is Lubavitch, which is a school of thought of Hasidism. Hasidism has many ideas based on the Kabbalah, and they have an idea that if one Jew does one mitzvah that actually strengthens God's presence in the universe. It's a bold statement, that is actually their belief. That's why it's important. That's why they want you to light Hanukkah candles, or Jewish girls, women, light Shabbat candles, the little 2-line ad in the bottom of the newspaper sometimes on Fridays, right? Because an individual Jew, because doing all mitzvot strengthens God's presence in the universe, because, I'm just going to put this in brackets, God's presence in the universe has become weakened because of some breakage in creation. I won't go into that now, okay, but there's been some breakage or damage, and we can help fix that damage by how we conduct ourselves, okay? That means we can affect the universe. That means we can strengthen God, or weaken God further, and we strengthen God by doing mitzvot, and every single mitzvah you do is one little iota of strengthening God in the universe. That's why Chabad drives around with mitzvah tanks and saying, just put on tefillin once, because they believe that it has, is metaphysical the right word? Okay, so remember I said that first aspect of the Sefirot is theosophy, okay? Theosophy means knowledge of God. This is called theurgy, which means impacting on God. We impact on God, according to the Kabbalah. We can strengthen God or weaken God. We can heal the fissures in the universe or further damage the fissures in the universe, further accentuate the fissures in the universe. There's a lot in that to unpack. We will not have time to unpack it today. Give me a second. So theosophy, theurgy. There's a third aspect of the Sefirot, which is psychological. So there are books, Kabbalistically influenced books, written about how the Sefirot are mirrored in the individual soul. That means you and me, okay? And it's kind of a system for understanding the mind or the soul. And so, like, I don't know, I'm now trivializing. Sorry, I'm trivializing. I know I want to be a good parent and raise my children well is chokhmah. How I actually decide on a bedtime and enforce that is bina. Undifferentiated wisdom, differentiated specific discernment. I'll just mention briefly the next two Sefirot, which are very important. Chesed and din, love and limitation, sometimes translated as severity, or boundedness, love and boundedness, okay? They talk about the balance of those two things a lot. If I'm giving out all of my cash to strangers and I have no cash left for myself, and I gave out my cash unwisely, that would be seen as too much chesed, okay? And if I say, I don't know, there are all these rules and strictures, and unless you follow every single rule properly, I will withhold everything from you. You could be my child, or you could be my neighbor or friend. That's too much din, or boundedness. And they're supposed to be in balance with each other, which is tiferet. Tiferet is translated as beauty, and beauty, a better word than beauty perhaps is, for understanding it, is harmony. So I just want to get into this now. We'll talk about it more next week, God willing, because some of the Midrashim say, I want to get this in before Parshat Noach, that we'll read this week. So the Midrashim say that the sin of the generation of Noach was too much chesed. So there are Midrashim that say that the generation of the flood had undifferentiated love, and undifferentiated love means people had sex with each other in an unrestrained way. They had sex with animals, and animals had sex with animals, and it was cross species. It was too much chesed. It was not bounded. I'm supposed to have love, but I'm supposed to have a kind of love only with my partner, traditionally called wife. Okay? And then I have a certain kind of love with my children that I don't have with other people's children. Okay? And, if there's limited tzedakah money, you give first to your own village or town before you give to other villages or town, right? So love is supposed to be, generosity is supposed to be bounded in an appropriate way. Otherwise, it becomes too much, chaotic, and that's damaging. So there's a strain of midrash that the sin of the flood generation was too much chesed. Everyone made love to everyone else in an undifferentiated way, and this is evil, okay? Because it needs to be bounded and balanced and harmonized with limitations. Okay, so to come back to my point, which is a third way of looking at the Sefirot, and there's something called the psychological Kabbalah. There's one particular book called the Tomer Devorah, which has been translated into English in more than one edition, which basically says these are 10 aspects of the human being. And by the way, there's also psychotherapy based on this. It's kind of a Jewish version of Jungian psychotherapy. You might need to work on having more deen to balance off your chesed. You might need more boundedness to balance your generosity. Or you might need more love and generosity because you are too bounded. Or you have all kinds of I'm gonna, which is chokhmah, but you have not enough bina, meaning how will I actually put this into action? And we'll get to other ones later. So the 10 Sefirot, 10. Now, to take a step back, we're used to the idea that there are different aspects of God, right? We talked about how in the Bible, there are all kinds of aspects of God, God can take an appearance and walk around and talk, or God is the fire which lives within the Mishkan, the temple, or God is just up in the heavens and left God's words down below. So we talked about how in the Bible, God is described different ways. And we talked about how in rabbinic thought, this is talked about in story language, right? God sometimes appears like an old man with a white beard when God is a judge, but God appears as a warrior, or God can appear as a lover, right? And we talked about how rabbinic thought, midrash, uses all of these stories from the Bible, the Tanakh, to say that God appears differently to us. So what Kabbalah does, what this system does, is rather than tell it in a story, it tells it in a way of abstract qualities. There's love and there's strictness. There's generalized, undifferentiated wisdom, and there's specific discerned planning, right? We'll get to the lower Sefirot, not today. So instead of calling it God so they might say, oh, God at the sea, was a balance of chesed for Bnei Yisrael and deen for the Egyptians, or something like that, okay? And so this system basically takes the idea that God manifests differently at different times and places, which is a familiar idea to us from rabbinic thought and from biblical thought. And it maps that differentness onto different qualities. And that can work three ways: theosophical, how we understand God; theurgical, we can strengthen God, okay? Or psychological, these are qualities within us also that we can work on. I've said much too much. I'm going to stop sharing the screen. And I'm going to pause if there are any questions or comments. I just want to say one more thing. To some people, I recognize that to some people, this is just like gobbledygook. To some of us, this is just like gobbledygook. And to some of us, this is like, oh yes, of course God has different manifestations at different times. By the way, and if I don't know, physicists and religious, thoughtful physicists and biologists write about this, and they might say, well, sometimes God is gravity and sometimes God is nuclear fission. I don't know what they'd say. They'd have a different version of this, and if you were Mary Oliver, the poet, sometimes God is the unfolding flower. Sometimes God is a baby being born. Sometimes God is a volcano. Sometimes God is a human being's last breath, right? Mary Oliver writes about nature and finding. So they're all different ways of saying divinity seems revealed or is graspable by us in different ways at different moments in our lives and depending on how and when we look in the world. And this is just one system for trying to say, that boils down to different qualities or aspects, and God, through God's will, pours these different aspects into the universe so that we can understand different aspects of God. Because the highest aspects, Keter or Ein Sof, are fundamentally unknowable. This is where, by the way, Jewish mysticism, there are parts of Jewish mysticism that have meditational techniques. And a lot of scholars say there's a fundamental difference between Jewish meditation and non-Jewish meditation, that in other traditions, you can meditate so you can merge with the infinite. That's a goal. Judaism says there is no merging with the infinite, period, end of story. It is fundamentally unknowable. We do not strive. You will not merge with Ein Sof or with Keter. Okay? There is ultimately a division between that and anything any human being. So trying to merge with the infinite is not something that is strived for. Okay, I'm going to pause. I'm sorry. Was this a lot of gobbledygook? Does any of it make sense? Questions, please. Are you interested? Are you bored? I don't know. Alan?
It was challenging here because there was a lot of noise in a different location.
Because you're in the room with the coffee. Yes.
That's right.
So it was worse than that. The kids were on the stairway right here.
Okay.
Taking off a racket.
Yeah.
We're not going to be here next time.
I got it.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
All right. The notion, when I think of the Sefirot, I tie it in with the Omer counting, where each week.
Don't get up to it yet.
Don't get up to it yet.
Okay, but Alan's foreshadowing. Okay, I'm going to say just a brief foreshadowing of that. The Sefirot are divided into the upper 3 and the lower 7. Okay, and the upper 3 are Keter, Chochmah, and Bina, which are relatively inaccessible to us. They're the lower 7, which are more accessible to us in human qualities. And that is very handy and dandy because the number 7 maps onto all kinds of things ritually.
Oops.
It maps onto 7 days of Sukkot before we get to Shemini Atzeret. And because each one of these Sefirot, lower, I'm going to put air quotes, lower 7 Sefirot is associated with a patriarch or biblical figure. That's why we invite the Ushpizin or the guests to our Sefirot, because day 1, the emanation that we contemplate is Chesed, which is associated with Avraham. So we invite Avraham to our Sukkah along with the 6 other ones. And 7 maps neatly onto the weeks of the Omer and the days of the week. And that's why there's certain little Omer counters which say, Hod Shebechesed. Today, I'm trying to strengthen the quality of God, which is majesty within love. And there are various little books that Hasidic people have written, or New Agey Jewish people have written, your Omer counter, where there's like a little page. I'll try to bring them downstairs tomorrow to show you if you haven't seen them. There's a little page on today, day 38. I'm working on my Hod Sheba Netzach. Okay, my human, again, this is the psychological Kabbalah, these traits within myself, and why am I working on that? Because this is a manifestation of divinity, and I'm trying to strengthen that aspect of divinity in the universe. So there are various kinds of ritual things, there are various ways in which the Sefirot map onto ritual. By the way, if you have a certain kinds of Siddur, not the conservative Siddur, it has a little Yehi Ratzon, before, may it be your will around it, before you do like the lulav and etrog or something, and it says, may it be your will that by doing this mitzvah, I will unite the Yud Hey with the Vav Hey, these two letters of God's name with those two letters of God's name. And that is Kabbalistic because it has to do with the fundamental rupture in the universe. So the Yud Hey is separated from the Vav Hey, and I hope that this one mitzvah helps bring the Yud Hey and the Vav Hey closer together, which even if you don't know anything about Kabbalah, I'm sure you would agree that bringing the Yud Hey and the Vav Hey closer together is probably a good thing. Okay? So what Alan is foreshadowing, and we will get into this, Alan, when we sort of finish the Sefirot, is how the Sefirot are used to sometimes map onto ritual in our Siddur, which is going to help explain to you certain things that you saw in certain Siddurim that you don't understand because it looks like gobbledygook. Because what does it mean that today's day of the Omer is Hod Sheba Netzach? So it has to do with the 7x7 grid of the 7, air quotes, lower Sefirot. So Alan,
two things.
So go ahead,
Two
Alan.
things.
But we're not going to talk more about it yet today. Go ahead.
I understand, but for the record, I don't view that as gobbledygook. I like looking at it and seeing it that way during the counting of the Omer, just for the record.
Right. Because, by the way, wait, let me respond to the one thing. Because if you look at these things as psychological aspects of divinity that are manifest through us, then that gives us access to, oh, yes, I need to work on this more because I am not X enough. And so today I'm going to work on X, okay? Because, and again, in a Kabbalistic sense, me working on X helps strengthen, this is how the psychological approach is linked to the theurgic approach. Me working on quality X helps strengthen the God's Sefirah of X in the universe, okay? So when it translates into psychological Kabbalah, it can actually be very compelling. Go ahead, Alan, with thing number 2.
And the second one, you were talking about how it's Chabad's mission to have everyone, do a mitzvah and
one mitzvah is a plus.
One mitzvah.
Yep.
That's right. Well, Chabad gets its name from the top 3: Chokhmah, Bina, De'ah.
De'ah. So De'ah, I'm gonna put it up again. Okay. So Alan's getting something very complicated, but I'm just gonna say it. Chabad stands for Chokhmah, Bina, De'ah. And De'ah, you know how Din and Chesed are balanced in Tiferet? So Chokhmah and Bina are balanced in De'ah, which is an invisible Sefirah right over here where my cursor is. It's just below Chokhmah, Bina, and they're balanced in Da'at, which is not one of the 10 original Sefirot, but in some more complicated systems of the Sefirot, there's I'm just going to call it invisible extra Sefirah in there called Da'at, right? Again, for us, these are all just, Hebrew synonyms for knowing. But within the system of the Kabbalah, they get technical differences from each other, right? So Da'at, knowledge, is somehow a balance or a bringing together of Chokhmah and De'ah, right? Chokhmah is, I'll speak biology. Chokhmah is A, T, G, and C. Remember that? High school biology? The 4 amino acid the four bases from which all of your DNA is created. Does anyone remember that? Right? So Chokhmah
I didn't learn that in biology.
You did. You're not that old, Alan. Chokhmah is ATGC, and Bina is everything that your DNA turned into in your body. It's your left fingernail. Okay? Chokhmah is the undifferentiated blueprint. Dea is the specifics, and somehow the balance of them is, Bina is the specifics, and somehow the balance of them is Dea, or Da'at, and Chokhmah, Bina, and Da'at, Chabada, stands for Chabad, right? So, yes, and the first Lubavitcher Rebbe wrote a big book called the Tanya, which is all about it's about Lubavitch's theosophical, theurgic, psychological, Kabbalistic system. Different, I'm going to put in air quotes, different schools of thought do different things with this basic system. But it all comes from this basic system. I'm going to come back to the headline, which is that God emanates God's self into our universe in different ways. These can be manifest to us as different qualities or attributes of God. We have aspects of these different qualities within ourselves, and we can do certain actions that help channel energy. I know this sounds heretical. By the way, this is the part where Maimonides got off the train. Okay? Right? Because Maimonides lived during some of the early, he didn't really early Kabbalah, just in terms of time, it wasn't there yet. But let's call it the followers of Maimonides, the Maimonideans. This is where the Maimonideans got off the train, that we can do things that strengthen God's attributes in the universe would be total heresy to any Maimonidean. Okay? So there were certainly people who thought this was ridiculous, this idea that what we do affects the universe. Ridiculous. Nothing affects God. God is unknowable, unreachable, infinite, unchanging. Okay? And that is not the Kabbalistic idea. And here is where, by the way, there were, in fact, all kinds of philosophical, ideological, and community battle lines drawn between, and by the way, because we're 21st century descendants of, I'm going to take back the word us, because many of us present on this screen are 21st century descendants of Eastern European, Litvish, Yeshivish Orthodox Jews. We think that the Kabbalah is some minority opinion, okay? But if you grew up in Yemen or Morocco or the 17th century, Kabbalah won, okay? And everyone, the Zohar was, again, I said in the Sephardic world, the Zohar and the Talmud were the two holy books that were studied. And this was part, and that's why there's Siddurim that say, yes, part of your, I'm sorry, we're going on so long and I got to stop. There's Siddurim that say, as part of your everyday worship, I am saying a little formula that says, I hope that by fulfilling this mitzvah, reading Kriyat Shema or whatever, right? I am, it's actually not before Kriyat Shema because you're not supposed to interrupt, but before, Baruch Shamar, okay, right? It's about, I am uniting, I think it's probably Malchut with Tiferet. I'm not 100% sure about that. Okay. So I am having the intention that I am trying to reconnect aspects of divinity that have become separated from each other. By the way, it's profound. You might see this idea as profound or ridiculous or simultaneously both. Okay? So I'm going to leave you with that idea that what you do strengthens God in the universe or weakens God in the universe. By the way, Maimonides just had a different formulation. We just emerged from the high holidays. imagine as if all the sins and all the mitzvot of the universe are balanced exactly 50-50, and your next action is going to determine the judgment. It's going to tip the scales one way or the other. It's kind of a very different formulation of a not that different idea. All right. It's just that Maimonides and the Maimonideans and the rationalists would say, oh, you're not actually doing anything metaphysically. You're not affecting God. You're going to affect how God judges your outcome. Whereas the Kabbalists would say, oh, no, we're actually strengthening or weakening some fabric of the divinity. I gotta stop there. I'm sorry we went on for so long. Okay, to be continued, Nick. Sorry if this was meandering. It's hard. This is a little bit like wandering into a jungle and trying to find some signposts, and then we're going to come back to all of these things. Here's the truth, by the way. I've never taught this material before. I'm not 100% sure pedagogically how to wander into the jungle. Okay, so we'll.
You're doing a good job.
Thank you, Terry.
Yes,
we'll feel it out. Okay.
You have been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast site or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Temple Beth Am Los Angeles, go to tbala.org.